Here to learn about if you're here to learn about the Universal Service Fund, then you are in the right place. Welcome to folks just joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute. And if you would like, you can go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. We always love to know who's here. Okay. We're going to get started. Okay. Welcome. For those of you I don't know, my name is Amy Huffman. I'm the policy director here at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and we are on part 2 of our summer policy webinar series. Last week we talked about the competitive notice of funding opportunity that NDIA released a few weeks ago to announce and officially open up applications for the competitive program under the Digital Equity Act, which we're really excited about and hope you all are too. We had a lot of folks on that webinar, and we posted those slides and the recording of the webinar and the listserv shortly after. So feel free to go back to that and look at that if you didn't get a chance to attend. Today, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about something kind of different. The Universal Service Fund and its history, how it all started, and where we think it's going. And so I'm really excited because I'm joined by some really amazing panelists today. But before we get started, I'm just going to give a little bit of background, and I'm going to open up some slides here. And I'm going to put it in share slideshow mode. Okay, can you see that? I'm gonna go with yes and also minimize this. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Universal Service Fund and a little bit about us. So just a little bit about NDIA. If you are new to us, we are the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We advance digital equity by supporting community programs and equipping policymakers to act. We have over 1,800 affiliates in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and 5 US territories. We also work with at least 30 different tribal entities across the country. And we talk about digital equity instead of equality because sometimes equity means that we have to, give a boost to certain populations to make sure that we all can achieve and receive the same opportunities, equal opportunities. And digital equity is the goal. So digital equity is where we want to get to, and digital inclusion is how we get there. So it's the programs, the policies, the tools that help us get there. So it's important for what we will talk about today. And then the road to digital inclusion includes, because the digital divide is multifaceted, you have to have multifaceted solutions, right? So we need to have high-speed, affordable internet available to everyone, or universal service, you could say. We also need to have digital skills training because people need to understand how to use computers and devices and the internet to reach those opportunities that are otherwise unavailable to them if they don't have those skills or the opportunities to gain those skills. Ongoing technical support is super important. Oftentimes you might have the skills to set up a password, but maybe not the skills to maintain those list of passwords, right? And so having someone to help in an ongoing basis for both your skills and with your devices. So folks need affordable and appropriate devices that meet their individual needs. And this is the road to digital equity. So why are we talking about USF? So our objectives today are just really to set a baseline of understanding about the USF Universal Service Fund, universal service as a goal, a principle, what the fund, what programs it funds, and how it's administered, because this is actually quite important to our field. You may or may not know, but these programs and this universal service policy has been the backbone of broadband and digital equity work for a long time. And moving forward, it's going to be just critical and essential that we not only understand it, but any modernization that happens, that we get it right. And so it's really important for you all to be aware about how it is operated currently, so that when we get into the potential policy changes of it, that you're equipped to talk about it with folks, with your congressional delegation or other folks that can influence how it's modernized. And so to do that, I am joined by some really amazing experts. We have Elisa Valentin, who's the Broadband Policy Director from Public Knowledge, Raza Panjwani, the Senior Policy Counsel from Open Technology Institute, and Andrew J. Schwartzman, who's a Senior Counsel at Benton Institute. And here I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to pull them up to join us. And I'm going to give each of them about a minute or two to introduce themselves and their work and what they do. And then we're really going to get into a discussion about USF and what it is, and the background and the future. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Elisa first. Introduce yourself and Public Knowledge and why you're here today.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Valentin. I am the Broadband Policy Director at Public Knowledge. We are a consumer advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., and we work on a range of issues from making sure we close the digital divide to intellectual property, AI policy, you name it. We're involved in it when it comes to telecommunications and tech policy. Before joining PK, I worked in the civil rights community at the National Urban League as a Senior Director of Tech and Telecom Policy. Before that, I worked at the FCC for FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks for about 3 years. And before that, I was at PK. So this is my second time working at Public Knowledge. But as always, happy to be joining the NDIA community and be involved in this conversation with you all today.
Thank you, Elisa. And Andy?
Hi, everyone. Andy Schwartzman. I'm currently the Senior Counselor with the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society. Benton, which goes back about 30 years, to 40 years, I guess. It did most of its work in media originally, but over the years, it's shifted its focus and indeed changed its name to reflect that its focus now is entirely on broadband deployment. Benton does policy work in DC. It has a research component, has some research fellows, and puts out some research reports on broadband and broadband deployment. Particular focus in recent years has been on ACP and costs and affordability. A lot of Benton's work these days is in the states, helping state deployment, working with BEAD programs, and also working on adoption programs in a number of states. I ran an organization called Media Access Project for 35 years, white hair, and we closed it down in 2012. And I went to Georgetown Law School for a while. And 2019, I became the senior counselor at Benton.
Thank you, Andy. And Raza.
Hi, everyone. I'm Raza Panjwani. I'm Senior Policy Counsel at the Open Technology Institute at New America. We advocate for universal access to communications networks that are open and secure. We have a focus on things like open internet protections, consumer rights, competition. We've championed broadband labels, and we've put out historically the cost of connectivity report to put a spotlight on affordability or the lack thereof. I've dabbled in a bunch of public interest tech policy roles previously, including private practice in law long, long ago before coming here. So excited to be here and to tell you more about this little corner of policy.
Just a little thing. And we're really excited that of all the great work that all of you do, Raza's work on the broadband labels. We have another webinar coming up on that soon too, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so Andy, we're going to turn to you to take us back to the beginning. So the roots of USF, or Universal Service Fund, they actually date back to the 1930s. Can you share a little history with us about the Communications Act and provide an overview of the concept of universal service and why it's important, and then how we got to 1996 and the Telecommunications Act in 1996?
Okay, this is going to sound a little bit like a college lecture for a few minutes, but there's a reason for it. It's very helpful to understand the basic justification from day one for universal service, because in doing the policy advocacy and explaining what it's about, it's helpful to understand and be able to portray this as not just some sort of welfare program, as Ted Cruz would have it, but something much more broadly beneficial to everyone. Actually, Amy, though, it goes back further than 1930. That's when the Communications Act came in 1934 and some precursors of it in 1927. Actually, the roots of universal service go back to 1913, 110 plus years ago. That was an era not unlike this one, where there was increasing focus on an activity in antitrust activities. They were breaking up trusts, and Teddy Roosevelt was very much involved. And there was a lawsuit against the AT&T, which at that time was developing its telephone services around the country and was getting very big. And they brought a lawsuit against AT&T, and there was a settlement. The lawsuit was dropped, in exchange for which AT&T agreed, and this is known as the Kingsbury Commitment. AT&T agreed that it would commit to providing universal service to its customers. The principles of universal service grew out of that. The notion, and this is critical and important today as it was then, the very language of the very early beginnings and continuing on through universal service was that society and the economy as a whole benefit from universal service. In modern terms today, engineers talk about network effects, the idea that the more people connected to a network, the more valuable it is. Think of two tin cans tied together with a string. That's one connection. Now connect 3 tin cans together with strings, and what do you have? You have A can talk to B can talk to C can talk to A, and all 3 of them can talk together. So you exponentially increase the value of the network with each additional node that's added onto it. The idea of universal service then was that commerce, public institutions, government all benefited when they could connect by telephone to sell goods, to administer government, to relate to each other. All of that remains true today to the nth power with the internet. So the goal of universal service benefits everyone. That's one of the reasons why we get some political support in more rural areas, but also in more urban areas from business and commerce, because they too want to be able to reach people. It's a lot cheaper for Citibank to to administer its credit cards, people can pay online and can check their balances online rather than call up or rely on a mail 50-cent stamp for the bill. And e-commerce companies get new customers. The cost of government goes down. Driver's licenses, permits can be issued online. That reduces the cost of government, reduces taxes for everyone. So as you approach universal service, it's very important to think of it as benefiting everyone. Okay, now the history, very compressed version. Until 1984, universal service was subsidized initially by local phone bills, but then as long distance service developed, AT&T, which had a monopoly on long distance phone service, there were some local companies that AT&T didn't control, particularly in areas that AT&T didn't feel like serving. But AT&T had a monopoly on long distance as it developed in the 20s and into the 30s. And what they did, a very conscious exercise, was to overcharge for long distance service compared to cost. The idea was that businesses and wealthier individuals used long distance, and by overcharging them, AT&T could subsidize the cost of local telephone service, reducing the bills for individual residential consumers. And then the sort of complicated system was distributed to local phone companies as well as AT&T. And it was done entirely privately, pursuant to this Kingsbury commitment from 1913. Along came the breakup of AT&T in 1984. So all of a sudden, long distance companies were separated and competing with local phone companies. Local phone companies were invited to come in to develop long distance service and so forth. So what to do? Conservatives never liked the implicit subsidies that were used to fund universal service. More conservative economists like subsidies to be clearly stated and understood. So the Reagan administration developed the precursor of today's modern universal service fund, in which a line charge was placed on local telephone service, and that was used to subsidize what became Lifeline today. That is, low-income people could get a subsidy paid for by the other local telephone users. We removed the subsidy from the long-distance system for that reason. Okay, so that operated, again, under the FCC, under its inherent powers of the Communications Act until 1996, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was a substantial rewrite of the Communications Act, formalized and expanded the universal service system that had been set up and Lifeline, and formalized it into what became the Universal Service Fund. Ultimately, they created a private public corporation called USAC, Universal Service Accessibility Corporation, to administer it subject to FCC control. And but the basic principle that there is an add-on to one's phone bill that is used to subsidize a fund, and that fund is now used for several programs, for a health program, for a rural deployment program, for Lifeline, and under the 1996 E-rate, which is so important to anchor institutions. All of that is a modern lineal descendant of that 1913 Kingsbury commitment. End of lecture.
I was over here taking notes. I don't know about y'all, but like the depth of knowledge and the wealth of knowledge that Andy is giving us today is just unmatched. Raza, so kind of going back to 1996, Congress, after this long lineage of history of this universal service commitment, Congress is deciding to update the Communications Act to include telecommunications. Can you just give us a bit more information about the Telecommunications Act and the different, Andy touched on a little bit, but go into a little more detail on the different programs that the fund established?
Sure. So to take the baton from Andy and pick up the story with a little bit of overlap here. So, right, as Andy teed up, for the better part of the 20th century, you had the AT&T monopoly largely handling phone service and all of what we needed to do to get to universal service. With the breakup, you now have to piece together all this stuff that was happening within the books of AT&T, right? It's just all accounting until this point. And so now by the early 1990s, Congress has to deal with the aftermath of, okay, there's this breakup, you have local companies, you have long distance company. We'd like to organize this a bit more. And you have cable television coming onto the scene as well. So by this point, Congress says, you know what, we want competition, we want to do a whole lot of stuff. And this leads to a massive piece of legislation, it's considered a landmark, the 1996 Telecommunications Act. For our purposes, here are a couple of things that are important about it. One, it marks the shift, arguably, from we're talking about telecommunications being about telephone to being about the internet. Now, they don't call it the internet, they call it advanced telecommunication services. But that's the direction we're finally heading in with this bill. It opens that door. The second thing that it does is it takes universal service, which is implicit in the statute, which tells the FCC, establish networks at a reasonable rate as much as possible that connect all Americans. Great. It adds for the first time now this section called universal service. You might hear the reference to section 254. That's the piece of the statute. And here Congress says, okay, FCC, we want you with the states, because telecom is this joint thing between states and the federal government, to review all of this universal service stuff, and we're going to lay out some principles for you. So number one, we want you to continue addressing high cost networks. This is, the networks that are built out to places where it's expensive to have networks, where it's expensive to maintain networks, where there isn't the density offered by cities that makes it less economically efficient. We want you to keep connecting those people. We want you to continue having the Lifeline program, which addresses low-income consumers and making sure they're still connected. In addition, we want you to make sure schools, libraries, and rural healthcare providers are connected. Okay, great. All that's bundled in. It also says a couple of other things, right? It says all regions should have comparable services wherever you are in this country, and everyone should pay rates similar to what urban rates are. It sets basically a uniform floor for what people should pay. So the commission, FCC, goes forth, it consults with the states, and begins overhauling USF. It establishes the E-rate program, it establishes the rural healthcare program. Now let's fast forward, right? You get mobile phones, they have to deal with that. You have broadband internet, they have to deal with that in some way. That's a whole separate lecture, so we're going to skip that part for the moment. But circa 2010, the commission comes around and says, okay, we need to start overhauling this stuff because we've written USF programs for phone, we need to write them for the internet. So we're going to overhaul E-rate, we're going to modernize it to make that funding available for telecommunications. We're going to modernize Lifeline to try and make Lifeline available for broadband. Not a whole lot, but that's where they kicked off and piloted that piece. We're going to modernize the high cost program, not just to keep subsidizing phone networks, but to start building out internet, DSL primarily, and get folks connected. So that's that shift to the internet and the programs. And you fast forward to today, and that's kind of where we're at. We've got a universal service program that is transitioning from primarily servicing telephone and making sure everyone's connected to telephone to trying to bridge the digital divide. Not quite getting there. That's why you get injections like BEAD and other programs, but that's the chasm it's trying to sort of bandage over. So that's more or less, I think, where we are with this fund. That fund collects $8 billion a year, roughly, and it then disperses that money to the high cost program, which is more than half of the Universal Service Fund. That's primarily subsidies to providers to provide or build out service, followed by the E-rate program, then followed in a distant third by the Lifeline program in terms of cost, and way in the back is the rural healthcare program. So you're thinking about the size of what this money is. Now, I'm not going to get into sort of, unless Amy, it's worthwhile explaining where the money comes from. Or you want to save that for another question?
A little bit. If you could just give a high overview of that, that would be helpful.
Okay, so remembering the history of USF, which is industry used to cross-subsidize internally the expenses of providing these services within their businesses. We've now had to break that out because the industry is broken up into parts. So we need to get some parts of industry to give money to other parts of industry, right? And that's what USF is. USF says we need $8 billion to fund these programs that we've decided are critical and need to be established. Industry, you need to pay in on a pro rata share based on what percentage of industry you represent based on financial forms filed with the FCC every year. You've got to pay in your share of that to make sure everyone's getting what they need. Now, the interesting thing is companies are allowed to pass that through. They can't just make up a number. It has to be representative. So you'll see on your phone bill, usually, a little line that says Universal Service Fund or USF Recovery Fee. And what that is, the company saying, great, I've had to pay into this fund. I want to collect that. Like Andy says, we like to break out the line item cost of some things and not just bundle it in sometimes. That's what's going on there. Now, the interesting thing is, I, for example, have a lot of family members on my cell phone plan. That's how we get that cost per line down, right? Friends and family. It's, let's say, $200 a month. The Universal Service Fund piece of that is only a few dollars a month because the Universal Service Fund piece is calculated based on telephone revenue. It's one of these interesting vestigial leftover things about how the fund is structured. They don't calculate it based on streaming. They don't calculate it based on data, just telephone. And so that's actually a very small piece of my bundle. And so you'll hear this thing called contribution factor, right? It sounds like a tax because it says it's 20%, it's 30%, it's going up. It's not actually a tax that says your phone bill is $200, you're paying a 40% tax. What that number is saying is industry, all of the money that you're making, this much of it is telecom revenue now. That $8 billion that we need for the USF fund, well, that's 20%, 30% of that one line item of your revenue. That's what that big number represents. It's not a tax on your bill. So that's kind of how it works. It's money going from one side of the industry being distributed out to the other, just moving from one pocket to the other via USAC. Yeah, that's my characterization of it. Other folks, like the court, which you're about to hear about, may disagree with that.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Raza. So Lisa, that brings us to today, right? Can you give us an update on where things are with the Universal Service Fund and the principle itself and why some folks say it needs to be modernized and where those current efforts stand and where we are in that process?
Yes, so I won't talk about the courts because Andy's going to take that over. But first, everyone should know that there has been a Universal Service Fund working group. And it was originally a Senate-only working group, but now it's a bicameral group that includes House members. So you've got Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico, Senator John Thune, that are the leaders of this working group, but you've also got Amy Klobuchar, Shelley Capito, Gary Peters, Jerry Moran, Matsui, and Latta that are also a part of this working group now. So this bipartisan working group was established to evaluate and propose potential reforms to USF with the goal of developing a bipartisan, we love bipartisan in DC, forum to guide education, awareness, and policymaking. Now, all of us that are on this panel have been in conversations with these offices on a regular basis to ensure that our priorities are reflected in whatever changes that you see as it relates to contribution and as well as the distribution side. And you've already heard Raza just explain to you that USF currently relies on contributions from telecommunications services. But this is the same base that we've been relying on for years and years when the landscape of the communications ecosystem has changed so drastically. And, we're more reliant on ISPs and the services that they provide more than ever before. And they're making more money than ever before, right? We use them to, connect for work, to get education, to access healthcare, and, entertainment. And yet and still we're on a cliff right now. So many people say we need to expand the base of who actually pays into this fund. Now, at Public Knowledge, We believe that accessible revenues should include broadband revenues. And a couple of years ago in 2022, there were over 300 organizations that filed with the FCC in support of this. But it's also important that we think about ways in which we can protect low-income consumers from being impacted, right? So some have proposed that there be a carve-out for those who are, ACP recipients, should that program be revived, so they don't feel the burden of having to pay in. But there are also other folks who believe that edge providers should have to pay into this because they benefit from internet infrastructure. So some believe that, video and music providers, social media companies, cloud computing companies, online gaming providers, e-commerce companies should have to pay in, right? And there's also a group of folks that believe that the contribution base could be expanded to include digital advertising revenue as well. So there's a ton of ideas floating around, ton of arguments happening. But I think that there's one thing that we all can agree on, and that's the fact that the USF programs are intended to serve high-cost areas, schools and libraries, and low-income communities, and that itself has not shrunk, right? And that's why modernization of this funding is so necessary. And, because I love music, and I know that Amy has heard me talk about this before, as well as Andy, just think about 1996. I want you to think about how long ago that was, and let's just do this in terms of music. For the Grammys in 1996, the best rock song was Alanis Morissette's You Ought to Know. Still a bop. We still love that song. Okay, but that was 1996. Record of the year was Kiss from a Rose by Seal. TLC won R&B Album of the Year for Crazy Sexy Cool. Meanwhile, 2024, Boy Genius won the Record of the Year this year. The bandmates were born between 1994 to 1996. Miley Cyrus won Record of the Year for Flowers. She was 2 years old in 1996. Victoria Monet won R&B Album of the Year. She was 7 years old in 1996. And to be clear, I don't think that the Grammys always do right, by the most talented people. What I am saying is that those same people who are making in the music in the mid-90s are not the same people that the Grammys are assessing in 2024. And right now, the internet is the fuel for our creative geniuses. So it makes sense for us to have policies that allow folks in high-cost areas in America today, folks who are getting connected via schools and libraries today, and those who are low income today, to actually have a real opportunity to thrive on today's communications networks. Things have changed, and the policies need to change with them.
I love that analogy. That's so great, Elisa. Also, thinking back to the 1996 Olympics, wasn't that in Atlanta? And we had the what did they call them? The Golden Girls, the gymnasts back then. It was amazing. And also those women are women today. They're not 16-year-old gymnasts anymore. And probably can't, well, I won't speak for them. Maybe they can still do those beam routines, who knows, but we got to keep up with the times. Okay. Sorry, I'm just, obsessed with the Olympics still. Andy, I think it's time to talk about what's going on in the courts. So the constitutionality of USF has been, been challenged. And then there was a ruling that just came down. Can you break it down for us, what's going on and what might happen or what is happening?
Okay, I'm going to approach this at a pretty high level because it can get very nerdy very quickly. As I've indicated, there's broad-based support for universal service. This includes the phone companies and the cell companies. Universal service, as we've heard, is in their DNA. And the money that they collect comes back to them on people's phone bills. So it, it's not a cost to them in that sense. So there is broad-based political support, and certainly most rural areas who benefit from a great deal from universal service funding also care about it. However, there is a more libertarian, anti-government faction in this country. Doesn't represent mainstream, even mainstream the conservative Republicans, But there is this faction that just doesn't like government and sees universal service as a government program. And they view universal service as a form of welfare and a transfer of money from them to other people. And they want other people to take care of themselves. An organization called Consumers Research, and there's a wonderful backstory about that organization, which I'll go into someday, and a couple other people funded by, in some part, we don't know how much, by the same person who funded the affirmative action litigation against the universities, for a series of challenges trying to get a case that could go to the Supreme Court. To do that, you really need a split among the circuit courts of appeals. Their fundamental premise is that the Universal Service Fund is an excessive delegation of authority from Congress to the FCC, and from the FCC to the quasi-private public Universal Service Accessibility Corporation, because it is a taxing power. Again, is this a tax or a fee? It's a taxing power that Congress can only legislate explicitly. This is a tax. And they say that the FCC does not have authority to administer Universal Service Fund, and Section 254 doesn't give the FCC adequate limitations on how that tax revenue, as they view it, is spent. Dramatic oversimplification there, but that's the core of it. Well, they challenged each successive quarter. There's a contribution factor, which Raza talked about. They challenged each successive quarter. They went to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won in the Sixth Circuit. Universal Service was upheld. Then they went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, another conservative court, and we won. And then they went to the Fifth Circuit, the most conservative circuit in the country, and we won in the three-judge panel there. So we were 3 for 3. And then the Fifth Circuit took the case on back. That is, they agreed to rehear the case with the entire membership of the court. They took a very long time. The case was heard and argued in mid-September of last year. And 2 weeks ago, they issued a decision by the narrowest of votes, 9-7, with several of the more conservative Republican judges on that court joining the dissenters. 9-7, they said that the Universal Service Fund, they didn't quite say it was unconstitutional, actually. Again, I'm trying to say high level, but they declared that it was invalid, that it was an excess, it was a tax, and it was excess of congressional authority to do it. And so now we are facing a complicated situation. The most likely scenario, and it's too early to tell, is that the FCC in the United States, the Justice Department, will seek a stay of the Fifth Circuit decision. And that stay, if not granted, they would likely go to the Supreme Court, and they will probably ask the Supreme Court to hear the case, and it's teed up for Supreme Court consideration, which is what the original petitioners wanted, because there's this split in the circuits. In that most likely scenario, the case will be taken up by the Supreme Court next year. A decision, again, most likely the end of the term next year, late May or June of 2025. I like our chances. This is not a slam dunk for the other side. I like our chances, but I prefer not to have to endure the possibility of something bad happening. And it is most likely that in the meantime, very little will change, because there is likely to be a stay. It is causing massive confusion in the telecommunications industry, particularly among the smaller companies. And since this is a regional split, arguably the decision, whatever it means, applies only in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi, which is the Fifth Circuit states. So there's just massive confusion. I would encourage everybody to stay calm and relax. Could be wrong. All sorts of weird things can happen, particularly with the Fifth Circuit Court. But my expectation is that nothing will change. The Supreme Court will take it up, and then we have to hold our breath if that in that scenario until next spring to see what the Supreme Court does. The good news, such as it is that the Fifth Circuit took a very long time to decide this case. If they had decided on a more normal schedule early this year, we would be facing a terrible dilemma at the end of a Congress where Congress can't get its act together to do anything to keep the lights on. This pushes any kind of potential cliff problem with the future of USF into next year, into next spring, perhaps even to later in 2025. And that gives Congress the breathing room to do the fix that we've all been working for and need. And one can hope that the new Congress will get it together. I don't expect anything in this current Congress, which is busy getting reelected and going home at this point. But one hopes that we will have an opportunity for the necessary legislative fix. But there is a doomsday scenario, but it's a year plus out, not immediate. Again, dramatic oversimplification of some complicated stuff, but I hope that was understandable.
Very. It's helpful for me. Again, this is super complex stuff, y'all. We're all still learning. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to some questions we've already gotten in. So if you have questions for these wonderful panelists, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get to them. If not, I have a long list we can go through.
Let me interpolate. My dear friend Olivia Wine corrects me. I constantly get this wrong. It's the Universal Service Administrative Company. I always get that wrong. Thank you, Olivia.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Olivia. We all owe Olivia a lot, especially helping us get things right. So can I just ask, this is for any of you, all of you, how does ACP fit into this, or does it? Can Universal Service take on ACP, and maybe even like, why hasn't it yet, right? Like, if Lifeline's similar to ACP, why has ACP not been part of the USF fund programs yet? And that's for any of you.
Yeah, so I think all of us are advocating for ACP to be included in USF. We have to find sustainable funding for the program, right? And we already went over a cliff, right? And we don't want ACP to be subject to appropriations every year or every 5 years, every 3 years, whatever it is, because that's harmful to the communities that we serve. And it's also just not the best use of taxpayer dollars or even philanthropic dollars to have to continuously have the same fights over and over again when it comes to annual appropriations. But I think, some of the things that we're thinking about are I guess I'll list out some questions. Do people need a mobile and an at-home connection in order to thrive, right? Is free service for most low-income communities the goal? Or is a $5 to $10 payment per month for low-income communities the goal? Is there enough consumer choice in the Lifeline program versus with the ACP market? How do we address the needs for modern day devices? And also, how do we sustain the digital equity field? So those are the questions that we're thinking about at Public Knowledge, and that we're encouraging the USF working group to work through. The ACP, absolutely, we believe that it can be folded into USF. But of course, again, there has to be reforms to who pays in order for the program to be able to sustain that amount of money. But yeah, and I would love to see a subsidy for both, again, a mobile connection and at-home connection. And what we have as folks on this panel, or as digital navigators, or as policymakers, everyone in this country deserves access to both.
Roz or Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Elisa really laid it out, which is we had this unique opportunity as a result of the crisis from the pandemic to do something that we've been trying to do for a long time, but no one wanted to do, which is we needed a real affordability program. The work that was done with Lifeline was yard by yard, inch by inch, tooth and nail. First, we're going to have a pilot program. Then we're going to get a little bit of a subsidy, $9 a month. And we were able to crack that wide open, first with the emergency broadband benefit, and then with the ACP. But here's the thing. When Lifeline started to grow in the mid 2000s and 2010s with enrollment, the costs went up. People were like, "Oh no, we can't have that. We need to crush that down. We need to be more strict in how we do things. Can't be spending that much money." The entire USF, right, is $8 billion. ACP went through $14 billion in less than 2 years. If you're going to roll in ACP as structured into the USF, you need to double the size of the fund. Now I'm here to say, yeah, I think we should do that, because you know what? We have a problem in this country of facing up to the cost of what it takes to actually address people's needs. We get scared by the number and we go like, no, we've got to do less. We'll make fewer people eligible for it, or find some other, trade-off. Fine. But I think the case has been proven. The desire and need for it has been demonstrated. And I think the ongoing effort to make clear to policymakers, to our representatives and senators, that you did something incredible, you need to bring it back. Too many people are relying on this. It makes a huge difference. It reduces costs when people are able to do telehealth, when people are able to look for jobs. There are so many benefits. So really tie it all together. We'll do all the legal arguing, but it takes the community to bring home those stories as to why it needs to be done.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we have like 3 questions here from folks. If you have more, again, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try and get to them, or even raise your hand. We're a fairly small group today. I think, Andy, this one's for you. Will the issue go to the SCOTUS with either decision? I think I'm reading that right.
I will construe it perhaps improperly as asking whether the cases that we won in the other circuits will go up along with the Fifth Circuit decision. And that's a complicated question. The answer is maybe. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, you can go with maybe, the perfect public policy answer, or it depends, right? Okay, so given, let's see, I don't know, this might be for any of you. Given the projected expansion of fiber broadband access, should E-rate, high cost, and rural broadband expenditures be expected to drop significantly within the next 5 years? I think this is saying like, okay, so, we've talked about contribution reform. And on the distribution side, the programs, do we expect, like, does high cost need to stay roughly 60% of the budget? So any thoughts or anything you guys have there?
I think maybe we need to think about high cost a little bit differently. We need to think about how we can like maintain networks once they're deployed, and how we can upgrade networks over time. And I'll also, mention that something that Public Knowledge has been, having conversations with the USF working group about is about network resiliency, right? So how we can make sure that we're able to recover after a natural disaster, right? Or we're all thinking about climate change, right? And I know in 2021, there was a study from the EPA that came out that said that the most severe harms of climate change will fall disproportionately on underserved communities who are least able to be able to prepare for or recover from heat waves or poor air quality, flooding, and other impacts. So we know climate change, that's a racial justice issue. Having resilient networks, that's also a racial justice issue. So I would say, kind of transforming that into kind of a little bit of a resiliency fund, and again, maintaining those networks, because obviously things are going to change a lot with the amount of money that's going out when it comes to the BEAD program.
Let me put a finer point on one piece of that, because it may be helpful for people to focus on this. We're really talking here back and forth over 2 separate but important functions. One is the capital expenditures of building the network. And we've got $42 billion going in the BEAD program for that. and another $10 billion that a lot of people kind of forget about from the Treasury Department. And there's also some work from the Agriculture Department. So there's a good bit of money on its way to go to build out places where it's necessary. But that doesn't support the cost of connection once it's there. Lifeline and programs like Lifeline and E-rate do that function. And we're going to need both pieces of that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, how does this affect local community media stations? They are losing funding because of their funding connection to cable television. I assume that because that question was asked a while ago, that's probably talking about how contributions have dropped, although I will certainly I think it's William who asked the question, jump in and clarify.
Well, let me see if I can try to unpack it. The community media, local community media, is supported under the Cable Act by a cable franchise fee for cable television and broadband service. And that money localities can and often do distribute for traditional cable access channels and other community media. In that sense, it's not directly affected by the Universal Service Fund, but it is entirely possible as we design and redesign a universal service and explicitly include broadband in there rather than as it currently is basically an adjunct to voice, which is how they kind of sneak it in under the current law. That is possible. And beyond that, I really can't speak to it.
Yeah, my question, thank you very much for just entertaining the question. My question is more just, I'm kind of going back to the whole when people were born at a certain time. I connect that public access because there's very few ways that the general population can get access to the public, but that would be through the community stations. And I know that they're connected to in that way. So that's going to change because most people have unplugged, right? So the funding has to dry up from the cable station. So kind of where is that funding coming from to keep that in place? But I appreciate you following up.
Well, I guess just to flesh out what I'm saying, insofar as what have the companies that have traditionally delivered cable television service deliver their service through wires in the ground, current law imposes a franchise fee. We can, it's unlikely that that's going to change because of the power of local governments in some total way. But as we go forward and we redesign all these things, we may well be able to or wish to reorganize some of that funding based on the fact that these companies are increasingly broadband only companies.
So we have one more question. What are the grant award amounts? I'm assuming that is, let's see, could whoever asked that question, or if you're able to unmute, what do you mean by grant awards?
For applicants who are applying for a grant, what is the average amount that they will be in?
So for which program, Dan? Well, I think
For the digital equity competitive grant?
Oh, that I could answer. Dan, we're not talking about that on this webinar. The competitive grant, the range is between $5 and $12 million. But I would refer you to go back to our webinar from last week about that.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take moderator's privilege here and ask a question of you all, and then we will wrap up. So, what is like your vision of what the Universal Service Fund can look like, and could it be doing that it's not doing now? And I know you guys all sort of touched on it a little bit, but would love to hear what your vision of what it could be and should be. And Elisa, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I would say that a re-envisioned USF is not built on the fact that there are like finite amount of resources to go around for just a few people, right? We live in a country of abundance, and I just refuse to believe in the lie of scarcity. So I would say a re-envisioned USF is one that's sustainable. It's one that allows people to thrive. A reimagined universal service fund is responsive to folks' needs, and it kind of forecasts into the future, and doesn't just live in yesteryear. And, like I said earlier, I want, it to be to match what policymakers have in their lives. A mobile connection that they don't have to think twice about, an at-home connection that they don't have to think twice about, a way for schools and libraries, which are the backbones of our communities, to get modern day support, a way for people to be able to communicate during emergencies. And, overall, I would say a reimagined USF has to be human-centered, and it has to focus on our most vulnerable communities in this country.
I love that. We are not in a country that's, defined by scarcity. Raza, what would a reimagined USF be in your view?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. We have the name Universal Service Fund. And I sometimes joke that it sounds like it's one thing, but it's really 20 subsidy programs in a trench coat that we've all kind of lumped together. And, over the last year, I've had so many of these conversations around, we just keep taking the same assumptions and we switch out one piece for another, and then we switch out another piece, and we keep hemming ourselves in, right? And what I said earlier, where the pandemic showed what was possible, we did the EBB, we did the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which demonstrated the kinds of things we can do to help close the homework gap. And now you see the FCC kind of mustering the will to say, okay, now that the ECF is winding down, maybe we can use E-rate for loaner hotspot programs out of schools and libraries, trying to push the envelope that way. I would love to see, a greater investment in digital equity programs on an ongoing basis. We've got the competitive grants. That's got us covered for 5 years, and people are going to do incredible work with that. But what happens in year 6? Right? I don't want to see a PBS documentary in year 7 about, wow, these programs are so great. What happened to them? Like so many of these efforts. So I would love to have a conversation around universal service becoming universal inclusion as well, right? And not just how do we move money from one company to another, but really drive home that investment impact to communities and people.
So great. Andy?
I'm going to give you a very abstract answer. Alyssa, especially, and Raza are experts on the policy implementation more than I am. But let me make a legal policy point here. And this runs up against some of the way the Supreme Court is going in terms of the relationship with Congress. But the genius of the 1934 Communications Act was that it was written in a flexible way to accomplish to accommodate changing technology. So the original words of the act did not include the word television, the word radar, the word microwave, the word laser, the word cable television. Yet the FCC was able to construe the broad language of the Communications Act to develop regulatory systems for each of those evolving technologies, and ultimately Congress would come in and fiddle with it. But that flexibility was really key. And I hope that whatever we do, we can try to future-proof it so that the universal service principles can be enacted in a way that's flexible enough to accommodate changing technologies. Surely nobody in 1996 anticipated that the internet and social media was going to become what it is today. And prior to the invention of the iPhone, nobody thought that they would have this powerful computer in their hands and that many people would use that exclusively for data connectivity. So we don't know what technology is going to be like, the dawn of an AI age. So I just hope that whatever design happens is done in a way that can accommodate future changing technology so we don't have to go through the kind of awful legislative crisis that we're dealing with now again and again.
Yeah. Plus 1,000 to that. Completely agree. Okay, folks, we have hit the top of the hour. Please join me in thanking Elisa and Raza and Andy for being here with us today and taking time out of their day to impart so much knowledge and wisdom for all of us. Just a reminder, our upcoming webinars in this policy summer series are digital. We have our next one on digital discrimination, which is another super fun topic, on August 14th at 2 p.m. And then the broadband consumer labels on August 22nd at 2 p.m. And we'll send out follow-up slides and this recording, and we'll have more conversations around USF in the future. So again, many, many thanks to the panelists for being here today and sharing your wisdom generously with us and your time. So, and thanks to all of you all for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here. Okay, with that, we will let everyone go. Thank you. Bye, folks.